Hello, everybody. A couple of years ago, in November of 2022, we did a show with the very distinguished observer of Putin's Russia, Mark Galleotti. It was a show about how Putin thinks like a warmongering 19th century imperialist and why, at least according to Galleotti, Ukraine will be his last colonial war. Galleotti had just come out with a new book, Putin's Wars from Chechnya to Ukraine. 2 years later, Galleotti is back. I guess, in a way, Putin's back. We'll talk about that during the show. Galleotti has a new book, Forged in War, A Military History of Russia from its beginnings to today. The constant theme in the two books, of course, is war itself, whether it's Putin's war or Forged in War. Russia seems to be all about war. Mark Galleotti is joining us from Broadstairs in Kent, not a military front, a very pleasant part of southeast England. Mark, has anything changed? We haven't talked for a couple of years. It's nice to see you again. Has anything changed fundamentally over the last couple of years in terms of how you see either Putin or Russia?
No, I mean, I think that, fingers crossed, doesn't mean any more wars, but I think the basic assumptions that actually Ukraine is proving so disruptive and so damaging to his military apparatus that it probably will be his last such war has been sort of continues to hold true. But above all, I mean, certainly this notion that he has of the world, this 19th century geopolitical notion of the world, I think is absolutely held true. That he doesn't really believe that a country like Ukraine can act on its own, that he sees the world purely in terms of a handful of countries that give the orders and an overwhelming majority who take them. I mean, that is still, even now, this is a man who clearly doesn't learn lessons easily, even now still seems to occupy his headspace when he tries to understand how the world works. He still thinks in those 19th century terms.
Well, your book is the new book, Forged in War, a military history of Russia from its beginnings today, from its beginnings to today, goes back way beyond the 19th century. It begins in what you call the forging of Russia, the wars of the 15th and 16th century. This is not a history lesson, Mark, but is everything about Russian history associated with war? Is that your reading? Is that the point of this new book, Forged in War?
I would say everything is associated with insecurity. I think there's two key points to make. One is that Russia has perennially felt insecure, doesn't have natural borders. It's in Eurasia. It's at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, and therefore, more or less, whichever is the rising military power of the age, whether we're talking about the Mongols in the 14th century or Napoleon at the beginning of the 19th century, at some point will decide they have to go through Russia. So, despite its relative poverty and so forth, the Russians feel they're constantly at threat. And as a result, they have to build a war-fighting state. So it's not that they're always at war, but they always have to worry about war. They always have to be thinking about war. And when you think about war all the time and you build your state around it, you probably will get into more fights, because the philosophy has often been, as Putin himself said, when he reflected on the lessons that he learned running with youth gangs in sort of still half-ruined Leningrad during his childhood, if you're going to get into a fight, you throw the first punch. So I think that's been Russia's really history. It's a history of what one could almost call aggressive defensiveness, that it feels a threat, and therefore it tends too often to decide that it has to throw the first punch.
It's all about boxing then. Two of the characters who everyone associates with Russia, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, they were both considered enlightened leaders, although they were despotic in their own way. How does Peter and Catherine, particularly Peter, fit into this narrative? I mean, of course, he was, in a sense, himself forged by war, but it was more than just war. I mean, he had an ideal of innovation and perhaps even Russian integration into Western civilization. How would you place both Peter and Catherine in your narrative in this new book?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, not least because Putin himself tends to draw comparisons between himself and historical figures, especially including those two particular greats. I think he sees himself as being a future Vladimir the Great. Peter the Great, absolutely, he believed in modernizing, but he was very much a man of his hands. He was a practical man. He wasn't really interested in modernizing the whole of society, especially not the institution of Tsarism. He wanted to make sure that he could get the Western technology he needed. So, for example, he travels through Europe, first Tsar ever to do so. Particularly, he goes to Holland and to Britain, at the times the great cradles of naval technology, because he wants Russia to have a fleet. And he hires captains and naval architects and shipwrights and so forth. He also goes and takes a look at Parliament when he's in London and leaves saying Russia is not ready for democracy. So I think this is it. What Peter wanted was all the shiny military technologies of the age, without the massive political and economic and social infrastructure that actually supported that. He just thought he could transplant it, which again is actually quite a Putinist notion, that basically you just simply copy or buy the technologies you want, and you don't have to worry about the innovation, the investment, or everything that went in behind it. And as regards Catherine the Great, a woman who at one point said, I have no way of defending my borders except by expanding them, which again might be a motto that Putin would warm to. She too, she was actually much more thoughtful. Herself, she was actually of German origin, and she did want to see a Russia that was more closely integrated with the West. She wanted to see more Western ideas being interpreted across the country, but even then, not at the expense of her own power. She was absolutely certain that nothing could limit the autocracy of the Empress. So again, I think what really comes out from this is there were some extraordinary, vigorous and dynamic figures in Russian history. But firstly, they were always war fighters. Both Peter and Catherine, although that's not necessarily what they set out to be, in practice, their reigns were marked by constant conflicts. But secondly, their idea of what a Western country looked like tended to start with military capabilities rather than social structures, laws, or any of the other sort of substructure behind it.
To what extent Catherine, Peter, and perhaps these early Russian rulers, to what extent did their obsession with war and their view of the world, which was bound up with war, color, I use that word carefully, their notion of building a Russian state? In other words, was there a distinction between the principles governing Russia's view of the outside world from the internal world? The anecdote that comes to mind here is Catherine the Great's decision to bring in a Western consultant, kind of a Mark Galleotti of 200 years ago, Samuel Bentham, Jeremy Bentham's brother, who came in to develop what has now been popularly known as Bentham's panopticon, the idea of prisons or schools or hospitals where you could watch over everything. Some people see this as the beginnings of what now is known as surveillance capitalism. In other words, was war itself viewed by most of these early Russian rulers, not just externally, but also internally in terms of their relations with, quote unquote, the citizens of Russia, although, of course, they had very few rights as citizens.
Well, the whole issue of rights actually is at the heart of this whole point. It's worth noting in terms of bringing in foreigners. Again, that has a long trajectory behind it. If one looks at the Kremlin and look at the Kremlin walls, so it's this red brick structure with these very, very sort of distinctive, tall, high, what are called swallowtail battlements, very similar to the Sforza Castle in the middle of Milan, because it was built by the same person. Even way back, Ivan the Terrible actually brought in military architects from, above all, but not entirely, from Italy, just as he brought in engineers from, say, Germany, because that was how you got the technology. Often you just simply hire the people who got it. So long tradition. But yes, look, if you think that you are constantly at threat, and you have long, hard to defend borders, and you're often going to be facing an enemy that is more technologically advanced or more numerous, well, you need to find ways of building up your forces. if you don't have naturally those kind of resources, and one of the problems for Russia is it doesn't go through an agrarian revolution. Getting very much in the weeds here, I apologize, but if one looks at
You're allowed to get in
transition,
the weeds, Mark.
brilliant. Well, that's much appreciated. Well, the industrial revolution that reshaped Europe was really on the back of the agrarian revolution, because once new techniques and technologies meant that farmers could produce more crop on the same land, you have more surplus, which supports trade, investment, and industry and cities. Now, Russia can't go through that agrarian revolution, courtesy of the nature of its soils, the climate, and so forth. Beginning of the 19th century, agricultural productivity is pretty much still at medieval levels. So if you're going to find the money to build up your armies and bring in your foreign experts and such like, and you haven't got a naturally expanding, burgeoning economy, the only way you can do it is by taxing it all the harder, extracting more from your own people.
Slavery, essentially, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Serfdom.
Well, it wasn't
was
just
basically
essentially;
land
it was
slavery.
slavery, no different from American slavery up until the middle of the 19th century.
Sure, and because obviously people resist that often, you actually also have to be willing to go in and stamp very hard on them to deter them from rising
But
again.
Mark, I mean, every state, the United States, the Tudor Britain, post-revolutionary Russia, post-revolutionary France, all the supposed bastions of democracy, they also grew up in war too. I mean, so there was nothing inevitable, was there, about the dismissal or the complete avoidance of any kind of democratic development in Russia?
Well, no, I mean, again, I don't believe in inevitabilities in history anyway. But look, you're absolutely right that all early states are basically war-fighting machines. They're about raising taxes to spend on knights or, in due course, musketeers or whatever else. The point is that actually most states are then able to start to outgrow that. It's not that they lose their militaries, but they begin to do all sorts of other things too. And it often precisely is industrial development, economic development that actually is a crucial part of that. Russia never quite gets to that, or for most of its history, Russia has not been able to get beyond that point. It's still having to basically, or feels it has to sink a huge proportion of its economy into keeping its military up to strength because it feels so under threat compared with other places. So in some ways, that's the point. It's about when you can diverge. Now, my basic thesis is that at a certain point, Russia was able to diverge, and particularly for the 20th century onwards, it really ought to have been able to break out of old thinking about the threats it faced. But for various reasons, which I go into in the book, it's not able to do so. And Putin himself hasn't been able to do so. But it doesn't mean that, therefore, this is somehow encoded in Russian DNA. And I think that there have been all kinds of moments, whether we're talking about Gorbachev and his attempt to build a new relationship with the West, in part by massive disarmament, or other times before and since. Russia will constantly be faced with options. Just that, unfortunately, although with Putin originally, when he first came to power, there was some thought that maybe he did actually represent a different type of leader. He's very much sunk himself back into past patterns that frankly now don't really make sense in the modern world.
Well, we're going to get to Putin in a few minutes. David Runciman, fellow British historian, has an excellent podcast imagining scenarios that didn't happen and seeing how they would change history. I wonder, in terms of Russian history, what would have happened, Mark, had Napoleon been successful in his invasion of Russia at the beginning of the 19th century? Might the whole history of Russia have been different? Might we see more democracy in the same way as we see it in much of the rest of Europe, where Napoleon was actually successful?
Well, I mean, look, it's a good question. It's one that obviously you've dropped straight on me. My gut response is actually, I'm unconvinced for the simple reason. Well, two things. One is, to actually be successful, for Napoleon to really have controlled Russia would have required a constant and massive deployment of force. And to be honest, this was a time when anyway Napoleon's empire was overextended. In order to do that, then frankly, France and the other territories under French control would have had to have been militarized the way that Russia has been, which would have therefore kind of required a lot more sort of, shall I say, anti-democratic process. But more to the point, I cannot see how it would have worked. The interesting thing is that when Napoleon took Moscow, Russia's main city, he was basically working on the European political etiquette of the time. That when the other country has taken your main city, you sue for peace. And he sat there in Moscow, becoming increasingly exasperated as the Russians refused to do that, as if they didn't understand the rules of the game. They were so barbaric. And indeed, in due course, he's forced to withdraw at massive cost to his Grande Armée. And I think this really shows the point that, in fact, it's very hard for a country to sort of actually defeat Moscow on that kind of a scale. You can inflict defeats upon Russia, but to actually conquer Russia, you require the kind of effort that, say, the Mongols or the other end of history, Adolf Hitler, had put together to at least have a chance. And that requires you to basically completely structure your whole system around war fighting the way that both the Mongols and Nazi Germany were. So I'm not convinced that it was possible, but if so, I think we would have seen a very, very different kind of France, which may well not have been sustainable. But if it was sustainable, I think would have been very unpleasant, because exactly, it would have been a militarized superstate.
Let's briefly talk about this window between the defeat of Napoleon and the Bolshevik Revolution of the early 20th century. Of course, the most notable moment was the dissolution of serfdom. But most non-experts, Mark, see this as a period of great political decline in Russia, where the institution of Tsarism declined on lots of levels. In terms of this 100 years, where there was, between Napoleon, I guess, and the First World War, relative peace, although there were wars associated with the Ottoman Empire. What happened in Russia for these 100 years, and how does it fit into your narrative of Russia being forged in war when there actually isn't war?
Well, I mean, as you say, there are a lot of wars, including putting down, I mean, actually, Tsar Nicholas I becomes known as the gendarme of Europe because he deploys his armies to put down risings, particularly through 1848 across Europe.
And of course, there is the Crimean War, conveniently forgotten, given
absolutely
shameful history in Britain.
But here's the interesting thing. It's that you have almost like a pendulum swing within Russia of, as always defined by security, but where do you see the biggest security risk? Is the biggest security risk external attack, or is it internal insurrection? And if you think the biggest risk is from without, then you're usually much more concerned about your technological backwardness, and you start to try and modernize. But of course, modernization is inherently destabilizing for any system. And therefore, it often leads to rising terrorism, insurrection. And then what tends to happen in Russia is all of a sudden you think, no, actually, no, the real risk is at home. And we need to just try and hold things down and basically be much more conservative and essentially just rely on what we have. And this is what happened in the 19th century, is that at first, with the defeat of Napoleon, the Russians were able to tell themselves, to a degree falsely, we're all right. Actually, we have taken on the ogre who trounced so many other European powers. It shows that actually we're not as weak as we thought, and that therefore we can focus on keeping things quiet at home. And remember that Tsar Nicholas I came to power amidst a rising by his own members of his own army. So he was always terrified of that. He has a very bad rep as a kind of unthinking conservative. I actually have a slight soft spot for him in that he understood that, for example, serfdom was both morally evil as well as economically bankrupt, but just he never dared do anything about it because he thought his job was to try and keep everything quiet. But then when the Crimean War comes along in the 1850s, the impact of Russia's technological backwardness becomes painfully evident. I mean, you have Russian artillery being outranged by British rifles. And the fact that because the British and the French, who are the most technologically advanced military powers of the age, were using steamships and railways, whereas most Russian troops actually just simply had to march their way to the battlefield, that even though this is a war being fought in southern Russia, Southern Russian Empire, I should say. I'm making no comments about modern geopolitics there. Nonetheless, actually, a battalion can be deployed from London to Crimea more quickly than it can be deployed from Moscow to Crimea. So, that's when they suddenly, at a time when also Nicholas dies, that's when the new Tsar, Alexander II, becomes painfully aware that actually trying to just hold everything frozen in place has left Russia exposed and vulnerable, launches a modernization, which is, again, largely derived to improving the economy so that he can improve Russia's military, which does lead to widespread instability and indeed his own assassination. So you do have this constant pendulum swing of where do you think the biggest threat comes, inside or outside your borders?
And then, of course, we get to the First World War, which was a complete catastrophe from certainly Imperial Russia's point of view. It wasn't just the Imperial Russia was forged in war. The Bolshevik regime was too. Often I think people misunderstand that. They assume it was some sort of idealistic revolution. But how intimately was Bolshevism, in your view, bound up with war? Of course, the Bolsheviks, cleverly or not, made peace with Germany, which established a degree of legitimacy and power eventually for the regime. But how do you associate Bolshevism and Lenin with your narrative in Forged in War? Was Lenin simply the next version of a Tsar, or was he trying at least to be something different?
I think, see, with Lenin, he's a complex character with a complex assessment. He was trying to be something different, but precisely the circumstances in many ways didn't allow him to be different. Firstly, absolutely, the Bolsheviks, they are not swept to power in the Great October Revolution, as it's called, on a wave of mass support. Essentially, it was a coup by a small, efficient and dedicated revolutionary group at a time when essentially no one was in practice running the country, which only could have happened because of the colossal impact of the First World War, which had basically already brought down Tsarism and was sapping the will of those people who tried to sort of pick up the mantle afterwards. So, Lenin himself, a year beforehand, had not thought he would see a revolution in his lifetime. So it was absolutely the war that created the opportunity that he took. But really more important was the Russian Civil War that followed. Seizing power turned out to be the easy thing, compared with then holding power and trying to sort of spread it from the cities.
An incredibly brutal war, wasn't it, on both sides?
Absolutely. God, horrific. All civil wars tend to be ugly, brutal things, but as is so often the case with Russia, there it was especially so. And in order to win, effectively, the Bolsheviks ditched those elements of their political philosophy, which were sort of still quite idealistic, faintly democratic, and so forth. There was still a certain potential within Bolshevism, one has to recognize. But all of that went by the way. The Bolshevik Party became essentially a dictatorial, militarized force where, you just simply follow orders from above. If need be, you use massive levels of brutality in order to win. So essentially, they sacrificed what one could almost call, shall we say, the soul of their party in order to win. And they did win. But that meant that they won not only control of what was then a devastated country because of both Civil War and World War I, but also in some ways, these kind of war-fighting attitudes had become absolutely central. And that was what, in due course, Stalin would take full advantage of, because he absolutely appealed not to the airy-fairy philosophers, but to the hard-nosed, heavy-handed sort of men who had risen during the Civil War.
Well, one of those airy-fairy philosophers was Trotsky, but of course he was in charge of the Bolsheviks militarily in some ways during the war, so he wasn't as airy-fairy as some of his perhaps contemporary fans think of him. Was the Russian Civil War, Mark, a weird time where both the internal and external paranoia around war were combined? Because of course foreign powers were also involved. Czech troops were involved in the war. The Western powers hovered and were supportive of the anti-Bolsheviks. So was it a particularly paranoid time in terms of warfare and violence?
Yeah, and it definitely set the tone. I mean, look, there's no way of getting around the fact that in the interwar period, the Soviet Union, as it emerged, was the pariah. The West, essentially hoped that the Bolsheviks would die off, in effect. But also during the Civil War, the Bolsheviks found themselves fighting the whites. They found themselves fighting nationalist secessionist forces. They found themselves fighting anarchists, other revolutionaries, and indeed, as you say, Western interventions. I mean, including my English grandfather,
And
who,
nationalists, of course, or at least
yeah, of course,
non-Russian nationalists who wanted to escape
yeah,
the Imperial Russian Empire.
absolutely. So I think this sense of being beleaguered, that there are enemies all around who will take any opportunity to tear you down, as well as that there are fifth columnist subversives and hostile ideological forces even at home, all contributed to the sense that basically the only way this new state can survive is essentially by becoming militarized, by imposing sort of a massive political superstate over society, and by essentially being as ruthless as needed. And all of that came through.
You're making me paranoid, Mark, and I'm not even Russian. Let's get to Stalin, of course. It's hard to avoid Stalin here. It seems, I mean, from so many narratives from great historians like yourself and Applebaum, that Stalin essentially went to war with maybe not all Russians, but certainly the Russian peasantry who made up most of the population. Did war in the so-called interwar period between the end of the First and Second World War, was it a perpetual feature of Stalin's Russia?
It was. I mean, at times we actually had it, very visibly during the so-called Great Terror, or during the collectivization campaign, which essentially saw almost all land brought under the control of the state, whatever the peasants felt about that. And even when there wasn't, again, there was this constant climate of wartime paranoia, where people were being encouraged to inform on their neighbors or their classmates or whatever else, when today's key Bolshevik figure tomorrow will be in a show trial, being forced, battered and bruised by the torture meted out upon them, to quote unquote admit that they had been a Western spy all along, and so forth. I mean, paranoia was one of the many weapons that Stalin used precisely to not only break the resistance or the potential resistance of society and elite alike, but also to maintain his own power. And in the process, he built a warfighting economy. In 1931, he said, "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced nations. We must make good this distance in 10. Either we do it or they destroy us." Well, he said that in 1931. In 1941, the Nazis invaded. And I think in that 10 years, he had, through the most horrifically brutal means, nonetheless built the kind of industrial economy which really could sustain and fight its way through World War II.
1941, of course, Hitler invades, shocked Stalin. Stalin believed Hitler, not the first or the last person to be misled by him. Stalin went dark for a few days, maybe a couple of weeks. Some people think he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. And then he kind of reinvented himself as a nationalist, almost like a czar. Was this the moment where Russia reversed to form in your narrative, Forged in War, a military history of Russia from its beginnings to today? Did Hitler's invasion of Russia simply enable Stalin to become a 20th century czar, no different from Peter or Catherine or Alexander?
I think so. I mean, because it did allow him to, as you say, reinvent himself. I mean, up to this point, he had basically been fighting a war against the Soviet people, destroying every single sector that could pose some kind of threat to him. This actually allowed him instead to become the avatar of the nation. And as you say, I mean, when he first comes out of this period of nervous breakdown, whatever it was that follows the initial invasion, a man who notoriously did not like doing public broadcasts because he was very self-conscious of his what for most Russians was a rather funny Georgian accent.
Yeah, he was no FDR, was he?
Absolutely not. But nonetheless, he comes out and he actually gives this national speech, and he doesn't sort of open it with comrades, but as brothers and sisters. He's now appealing to the kind of the loamy nationalism of essentially the Russian people. We see the churches, which have been suppressed, begin to be reopened precisely for this reason. Even Soviet generals suddenly acquire new uniforms, which are basically echoes of Tsarist generals' uniforms. So, in anything from its state iconography all the way to its rhetoric or whatever, you do have Stalin essentially trying to draw on every aspect of Russian history that is convenient. And the very fact that they end up calling World War II the Great Patriotic War, well, the first patriotic war, as they describe it, is the war against Napoleon. So this is a man who is clearly now reaching back into the toolbox of history in order to construct for himself, a new notion of the state. And yes, so much of it does depend on Tsarism, in the same sense that in some ways the monarch is separate from the people but stands for the people. It may not be because he is a divine right monarch like the Tsar. Instead, he's legitimated by Marxism, Leninism, that for most Russians is as distant a concept, frankly, as heaven.
Yeah, and he and Lenin, of course, were fetishized in the same way as leaders. Did we get all of this wrong in the Cold War, we, the West, Mark, in assuming that Soviet victory in the Second World War and then occupation of Eastern Europe and its rivalry with the United States was somehow premised on ideology, on communism, whereas given your narrative, your thesis of Russia always being forged in war, we should have understood post-Stalin's Russia after 1948 as a military empire, not much more or less.
I mean, it's difficult because clearly ideology matters to some Soviet leaders as well as some Soviet citizens, though I would say decreasingly so. And so too is, in some ways, ideology is the mantle in which they wrap themselves. Most countries tend to find legitimating narratives, especially if they're going to be involved in attempts to expand their power across the world or whatever. Whether we're talking about the shining city upon a hill, whether we're talking about divine right, religious sort of mandates, or whether we're talking about the fact that you have an ideology which conveniently sort of says, well, this will be good for all of humanity, so let us impose it. But yes, when it comes down to it, it's hard to see how the Soviet leadership behaved that differently from how one could have imagined the Tsarist leadership doing had they been in a similar position. Because, of course, after World War II, suddenly they're a superpower. They have some massive armed forces, and very soon they have nuclear weapons, which more or less means that you don't have to worry about actually being occupied by an enemy anymore, because you can basically threaten thermonuclear Armageddon. So, the whole nature of conflict has changed, and it's going to be projected out often into proxy wars in the sort of post-colonial world and such like. But when it comes down to it, maybe I'm being over cynical here. I tend to feel that ideology is just used to justify what they do rather than being why they do it.
So fast forwarding to 1989 and another crisis of another Russian militarized regime. Was the collapse of communism in many ways, Mark, equivalent to the collapse of Tsarism? And then in terms of your thesis, were there windows of agency? I mean, many books have been written about the possibility of creating a democratic Russia after the collapse of Tsarism, the potential for the February Revolution. Similar books have been written about Gorbachev and Yeltsin and the potential for a democratic Russia. What's your narrative here? Was there agency? You keep on saying there is, but it doesn't sound as if in practice there is much agency for the people who run Russia.
I mean, it's hard, but I mean, again, I think there is absolutely agency. And if one takes a look at Gorbachev, I mean, in some ways, The problem there was that Gorbachev was arguably the last true believer in the Soviet Union. I mean, this is a guy who still believed in Marxism, Leninism, and he
You're a
felt
bit of
that
a
it could be
dimwit,
saved.
really. I mean, even a 5-year-old would have understood that it didn't work.
Well, I mean, again, yes,
So he
whether
wasn't
it
up
was
there with
dim.
Catherine or Peter the Great or Lenin. He
No.
wasn't a great thinker, was he?
No, exactly. I mean, I think that he deserves credit for actually being arguably one of, I think, if not the first Russian rulers who, when it came down to it, was not willing to use violence to maintain his position. And that is, I think, quite a significant thing, both in terms of what it says about him, but also actually for Russia's future. But no, I mean, let's suggest that in fact
coming
Gorbachev
back
had
to
been different.
Gorbachev, it's not really surprising then that he's beloved in the West as this sort of chubby, huggable Russian uncle, and hated in Russia. I mean, it was great for us in the West, but not so good for Russia. So he didn't have an alternative. It wasn't as if he had a free market ideal. He wasn't imagining Russia as Singapore or South Korea. So he was bound to fail, wasn't he?
I mean, I think he was bound to fail ultimately, but again, it's a question of how he fails and when he fails. And here, you know, it's not just simply about agency; it's about almost chance. I mean, had the hardliners not tried to launch a coup against him in August of 1991, which essentially cut him off at the knees and allowed his main rival Boris Yeltsin to essentially come to dominate Russia, then we may well have seen a different kind of process. I mean, I think ultimately, would the Soviet Union have survived another 5 years, 10 years? No, not in my opinion. But nonetheless, it may well have moved in different directions. But the point is, you know, again, if one comes to agency, I mean, again, likewise, Boris Yeltsin, the man who replaces him, you know, this is a man who is essentially a destroyer rather than a creator. When he has a target, when he has an enemy, he's incredibly effective and focused. But he too, in some ways, I would say he had even less of a vision for what he wanted for Russia than Gorbachev. You know, he knew he wanted to beat Gorbachev, but then when he had power, that's when he basically sort of ran out of ideas. So yes, one could say, well, these silly Russians, they can never basically break out of this cycle. And yes, they still haven't yet. But the point is, no country breaks out of its cycle until the point when it does. You know, and then yes, we can look at all these failed moments, but the point is there were opportunities. If Gorbachev had been a different person, if he had not been essentially had his political career destroyed in 1991, if Yeltsin had been a different person, things could have been different. Or indeed, if we had adopted different policies in the 1990s. I mean, I think we also share a certain amount of blame.
Lots of books have been written about that. Meanwhile, well, Gorbachev was destroying himself. Yeltsin was drinking. There was a young KGB officer in Dresden in '89 who was reading history like Lenin did when he was in Zurich in 1917. How do you fit Putin into your narrative in Forged in More? As I said, you last time you were on the show, you were talking about Putin's war. So a lot of the narrative in this work is built around your experience of Putin. You're an analyst in your day job, so you spend a lot of time looking at Putin's Russia. Was, in your view, it's so hard to tell. So many books have been written about this. Did Putin know what he was doing, or was he himself used by the military, industrial, or the surveillance services in Russia to reestablish the old world?
Yeah, I don't think Putin had some grand strategy. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think Putin was, as it were, aiming for the presidency. What he was like so many other figures in the 1990s, desperately on the make, leveraging what he had, which was actually administrative resource initially as the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, to make money, to make connections, to basically do business. He was an administrative entrepreneur in that respect.
A successful one.
A successful one, exactly. And he rose as everyone's favorite bagman. He was the guy who you wanted to have at your back, who would make sure that all your problems went away and that no one looked into your big deals and so forth. And he was basically plucked out of relative obscurity by a cabal of people around Boris Yeltsin who realized that basically Yeltsin was, as you say, drinking and drugging himself to death and was no longer able to be in charge. And they wanted someone whom they thought was going to be not just sober and upright, but also biddable, cynical front man. And they thought Putin was that guy. And so they picked him. They very quickly elevated him. And then once he was in power, Putin made it clear that he wasn't willing simply to continue just to be their bagman, but was going to be in charge. But the thing is, none of this is because of long-term strategy. This is all about people responding to particular situations. And so Putin suddenly finds himself in the year 2000 president. And yes, he knows, broadly speaking, that he wants to reestablish order in the country, which had spent 10 years basically in anarchy. He's a nationalist. He wants his country to be regarded seriously. He thinks that Russia is a great power, really as its birthright. But I don't think he has any vision at first of how you get there. And so, particularly in his early reign, he's essentially flailing around. At one point, he's saying that maybe Russia should join NATO. At another point, he's basically inveighing against the West for trying to berate him for human rights abuses during its war suppressing Chechnya. Again, this is someone who's still coming to terms with the nature of his job and his challenges. And what he does is he reaches back into history. You said, he reads history. We know that's about the one thing he really does read. And he looks at history as in some ways providing him a guide and a toolbox for how he's going to do his job.
Did we miss a trick, Mark, with Putin? Were there moments where, because clearly the current situation is not something that we celebrate in the West, the Ukrainian invasion, the military buildup. Were there moments where the West could have understood Putin's dilemma and re-architected, quote unquote, our relationship with him, so we acknowledge some of the challenges and pressures on him, but at the same time try to forge a Russia that isn't purely associated with war?
I mean, I'll be honest, I think that actually our main mistakes.
I hope you're always honest, Mark.
I think that our main mistakes were actually in the 1990s. That was a much more fluid moment. And in some
ways,
with
Gorbachev and Yeltsin?
Well, with Yeltsin above all. I mean, basically, we didn't really care about Russia. We just wanted Russia not to be a problem. And
so
therefore,
it's the neoliberal argument that we were just sweeping them into an economy and all we wanted was profit.
And also, we just basically wanted to ensure that Russia was not going to basically sort of get in the way of our other policies. So twice in particular, when Yeltsin went beyond the bounds of democratic practice. In 1993, he shells his own parliament to resolve a constitutional crisis. 1996, essentially, the election is rigged in order to stop the communists from winning. And because we didn't like that particular parliament and because we didn't like the communists, we didn't actually raise any red flags at that point. And then we get surprised that the Russians think that we're sanctimonious hypocrites and that democracy is always a sort of a stage-managed sham. But anyway, going on to Putin, I mean, I think the problem is this, that I think Putin himself never really understood the West. He does have this very zero-sum notion that everyone is basically trying to do everyone else down. There's a limit to how far we could have exceeded.
Well, there are people, Mark, in the West, like a certain Donald Trump, who perhaps does conform to Putin's worldview or vice versa.
Absolutely, which is why Putin can get on with Trump. I mean, I don't suggest for a moment that they are sort of great friends or whatever, but I just do think that they are, shall I say, on a closer bandwidth to each other. But the point is that also there were times when we needed to be a little bit more robust. The old adage of speak softly and carry a big stick, too often we spoke loudly and waved a small twig. That, for example, when Putin invaded Georgia in 2008, we lambasted him, but we basically did nothing.
Was that Obama or Bush or both?
Oh, gosh, this is American politics. Don't ask me about that. I'm trying to think. No, I'm sorry.
Well, it's probably both.
Yeah, but I mean, but generally speaking, I mean, then with Obama, yes, it was Obama actually, because then there was the offer of a reset, very, very quickly.
Well, Obama is very good at speaking loudly and carrying a twig, but
it established this notion in Putin's head precisely that we can be safely ignored, but that also nonetheless, that we keep being censorious towards Putin. I think this was our problem. I have no problem with criticizing Putin and his various misdeeds. I also have no problem with responding robustly when he acts in ways that break the world order. But on the other hand, our problem was precisely the disconnect between the two, that we spoke loudly and did nothing. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that he felt that, in fact, we were a faded, declining, or ultimately sort of fairly pointless force, and that he could do increasingly what he wanted to do.
Mark, you write a very entertaining column for the London Times. One of your recent pieces is entitled "Putin is moody and misfiring. His regime is getting worse." But you also wrote a piece recently suggesting that Russia is building an axis of the anti-West, and I'm quoting you here. This should be the title of your new book. Is it springtime for the authoritarians? So where are we, Mark, in October 2024 when it comes to Putin's Russia? Is it springtime for the authoritarians, or is it fall? Are we coming to an end of this moment? Are we just before the First World War, or are we at the beginning of an even more militarized, Putin-esque or post-Putin state in Russia?
I mean, I think the interesting thing is that you get very different visions if you look, shall we say, out of Russia's boundaries or within it. I mean, looking out, yes, this is a time in which actually Putin can be really quite happy with what's going on. That it seems that generally democratic countries are sliding into sort of populist turmoil. You have the UN Secretary General coming to Kazan in Tatarstan to shake hands with Putin during a BRICS summit, but not willing to go to the peace summit that Ukraine calls and such like. So basically,
And being
it does
banned
seem to
from Israel, which only adds to.
Absolutely. So put all this together, and it does seem to be that in fact the high water mark of Western/democratic power has definitely passed. But the interesting thing is, if you look inside Russia, actually, there are growing strains. I mean, the economy can basically sustain this current war effort for, I think, at least another couple of years.
We always hear that. A couple of years, though, in Silicon Valley, a couple of years is a couple of centuries. We've always heard this ever since he invaded. Oh, the economy won't work. It can't last for more than a couple of years. And it's always a couple of years, Mark. And a couple of years just gets kicked down. It becomes the can that gets kicked down the road.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, I've not been
I'm not saying you,
a couple
but
of years
generally.
But I think what we can see is precisely we're beginning to see the stresses beginning to build up on the Russian economy. You've got a base rate from the central bank of about 19%. You have a labor market which is now absolutely at full stretch. There's no room to expand the defense industrial complex, except by poaching from the rest of the economy, which is happening. And generally speaking, there is a growing sense of disquiet within both the elite and the masses, which doesn't mean to say that they want to surrender. I mean, on the whole, they still, they may not have wanted Russia to get involved in this war in Ukraine, but once it is involved, they would rather it win than lose. But a sense, as it were, that 24 years on, Putin is no longer the same Putin, or maybe that the needs of the country have changed. I mean, that is really quite
moody
palpable.
And misfiring. That's a sort of.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he blundered dramatically. Last year's military mutiny by the Wagner mercenary group, was very much because he had failed.
In your book, Downfall, Prigozhin, Putin, and the New Fight for the Future of Russia.
And I appreciate the little plug there. But yes, I mean, but that happened precisely because Putin put off dealing with a crisis. People were telling him that the rivalry between the mercenaries and the defense ministry was becoming a real challenge. But because it was a tough decision, he didn't really know what to do. He did nothing. I think often what we're finding is that sense of there are a lot of people who are, we have to recognize, kind of smart and effective managers in Russia, the technocrats running the economy, some of the generals and so forth. But the sense of a lack of political leadership from the top is really quite sort of clear. So if I was going to play the historical narrative sort of game, in some ways this is a little bit more like the start of World War I than World War II. There is that sense of a monarch who is both absolute, but also not really up to the challenges of the moment. Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have another Bolshevik revolution by all means. But nonetheless, I think it is clear that, as I say, when Putin looks at home compared with looking abroad, it's not quite such a positive picture.
Final question, Mark, as I'm sure you know, there's an election in the US in a couple of weeks. If Trump is elected, he clearly wants to be in bed with Putin. Whether Putin wants to be in bed with Trump is another matter. Might we be returning not to the period before the First World War, but the period after Napoleon, to a kind of concert of Europe, of incredibly conservative states bent on quashing one kind of democracy or another? I mean, if Trump comes to power, he clearly has no great affection for Western Europe or the EU. He's clearly sympathetic to Putin. Is it conceivable that if Trump comes to power, the Republican Party in the US is ambivalent about Russia? They're certainly not going back to the Cold War. Might they force a peace, quote unquote, in Ukraine, and create a new world between them, this kind of militarized kleptocracy combination of Trump and Putin? Or is that a little too fictional, too pat and convenient?
I mean, I think it represents a kind of an extreme end of the fan of possibilities. I mean, absolutely, Trump has claimed that he would very quickly impose a ceasefire on Ukraine.
And can he do that, Mark? I mean, you wrote an interesting piece in The Spectator about Zelensky's victory plan unlikely to impress Europe, whatever that victory plan is. If it's not going to impress Europe, it's certainly not going to impress Donald Trump.
Yeah, look, he in theory could, because what he's threatening is that he would tell the Russians, if you don't accept a ceasefire, we will massively increase our aid to the Ukrainians. And more to the point, he would say to the Ukrainians, if you don't accept a ceasefire, we will stop our aid. And let's be honest, Europe can stump up money for Ukraine, but it cannot make up the shortfall in terms of military capacity if America pulls out, because you can't basically buy Patriot missiles off Amazon and so forth. So, I mean, I think in theory, is it possible? The interesting thing is, if one looks at the Russian press and discourse, they're actually much more cynical and skeptical about Trump. They appreciate what he says, and wouldn't that be nice? Because a ceasefire clearly would be in Putin's interests. But they also know that he tends to talk more than he acts. And they were, to a degree, burnt by his first presidency, in which, for all his talk about his great relationship with Putin, actually policy towards Russia at the end of it was tougher than at any point since 1991, not because of Trump, but because of Congress. And Trump just simply didn't want to put any resources into stopping it. Basically, Trump is interested in Trump, full stop. So I think from the Russians' point of view, they regard this as a little bit of a win-win. If Trump gets elected, whether or not he carries forward with his policies over Ukraine, he is the disruptor in chief. He will create all sorts of chaos, dislocations, and dismay within NATO, within the wider Western world, and maybe room for all kinds of deals on sanctions or the like. And if Trump loses, well, there is the assumption that his partisans will cry foul and that there will be a lengthy period of disruption. And from the Russians' point of view, disruption of America, or indeed any aspect of the West, is almost as good as state capture. So, I mean, at the moment, they are feeling, I think, surprisingly comfortable about the forthcoming election, because ultimately they think that Trump may not be their friend, but he is rather more the enemy of so many of the institutions at the heart of the West.
Well, Mark Galleotti, I hope it won't be another 2 years before we get you back on the show. One of the wisest men on the history of Russia, on Putin's Russia. The author of an important new book, Forged in War, A Military History of Russia from its beginnings to today. It's out in early November. Thank you so much, Mark. It's probably not the most encouraging narrative, but it's more important to be honest than sympathetic. So thank you so much, Mark. Keep safe, and we'll talk to you in the not too distant future.